It's been 2 years since the initial COVID-19 lockdowns. Over 300 million people are currently infected, and 5.5 million people have died. What has the world done right? What has it done wrong? And what do we need going forward? I'm Mitch, and let's talk about it. People were infected and died in greater numbers due to such minimal initial guidance. Masks were not nearly as widespread, social distancing may have been subconscious but not enforced, and overall lack of hygiene, as evidenced by previous flu seasons, caused the power of the initial wave. Just as a side note, flu infections, hospitalizations, and deaths actually fell considerably in 2020 and 2021 due to all the measures put in place to stop the spread of COVID. According to a study by Deep Knowledge Analytics, Beijing ranked highest in quarantine efficiency, followed closely by Abu Dhabi, the capital of the UAE, and Singapore. It's no mystery numerous countries were wildly slow to impose and enforce lockdowns. United States. And this was the greatest detriment to the first waves of the pandemic. By not imposing said lockdowns, cities were hit hard and fast. This was most notably evident across Italy, which saw quite possibly the worst of COVID throughout 2020. The vast majority of North and South America, Europe, Asia, and Oceania have at least 50% of their population fully vaccinated. There are a couple outliers to note. Firstly, Chile has one of the highest percentages, with 88% of their population vaccinated. A few countries in the Middle East have percentages below 20, notably Syria and Afghanistan. And then, of course, there's Africa. There are about 4 countries with at least 40% of their population double vaccinated. The vast majority, however, are at less than 1 or 2%. Some countries don't even have 1% of their population at a single shot. COVAX, an initiative by the WHO, aims for increased vaccine equity. This includes not only equal distribution of vaccines, but also to share technology, know-how, and public health-oriented licensing. This basically means sharing of technology so smaller companies can develop the vaccine, thus increasing production and allowing for more centralized distribution around low vaccination areas. The WHO claims that there are enough vaccines globally to, quote, drive down transmission and save many lives. Approximately 23.3 billion vaccines are needed to give everyone 3 shots, which I believe will become the norm with new variants, such as Omicron. However, a 3-shot vast majority of the population is an enormous stretch for wealthy countries and an impossibility at this point for anyone else. So instead, 5.5 billion vaccines is a more realistic venture, thus making the whole of the world double vaccinated. Global vaccine production is at around 1.6 billion vaccines per month, and about 9.4 billion doses have already been given so far, meaning about 6.1 billion doses are needed for the world to be double vaccinated. In theory. The reality is that richer countries are prioritizing a 3rd shot instead of at least 1 shot worldwide, resulting in a massive divide. Of course, this isn't all too surprising, but I just want to bring it up because Burundi, a sub-Saharan country, has less than 0.1% of its population single vaccinated. In comparison, Chile, like I mentioned earlier, has 92% single vaccinated, 88% double vaccinated, and 61% with a booster shot. This difference is insane, and the COVAX initiative needs to step up if any form of vaccine equity is to be reached. Also, finally, a bunch of this info came from a super helpful interactive map from the New York Times, which I will show on screen and link down below. The pace with which the vaccines were developed was/is astounding. Many anti-vaxxers use this reasoning to discredit the vaccines, claiming that, quote, pharma cut corners, or they knew about COVID beforehand. But keep in mind that this is a global pandemic, and speed was of the essence. COVID isn't comparable to other diseases because, firstly, a version of a coronavirus has been viewed before during the 2002 to 2004 SARS-CoV-1 outbreak. Secondly, like I said, speed was key, considering this is a quite infectious and relatively deadly virus. No doubt you've heard of the immense supply chain shortages, resulting in a backlog of in-demand products and cargo ships stuck at sea. The supply chain design methods in everyday use today date back to the 1990s, when the competitive demands were different from those that firms now face. There's a great site that outlines 5 things firms are reviewing in their design processes, and I'm only going to go over 2 for the sake of time, but I highly recommend you check the site to read out the other 3 after this video. I'll link it in the description down below. So number 1, the emphasis on long-term periodic design reviews is giving way to tactical continuous reviews. This basically means that companies are now reviewing their supply chain constantly and quickly in order to be more adaptable, as opposed to long-term and egregiously thorough testing. This is because descriptors such as uncertainty, volatility, complexity, and ambiguity define markets and the supply chains that support them. I will note, however, that with the advent of quants in the early 2000s and the computational power of modern computers, markets are astronomically easier to predict than in the 1700s underneath a buttonwood tree. This proactivity is preferred instead of having to start a design from scratch anytime a large-scale crisis occurs. And number 2, there is increasing interest in building local/regional redundancy into supply networks and multi-sourcing. Local and regional redundancy are basically fallback solutions if a backlog occurs. Obviously, businesses need to build these redundancies into their supply chain designs because backlogs result in bigger expenses for everyone involved. Companies are turning to localization as a risk mitigation strategy, meaning emphasis is moving from global systems to more regional chains. Like I said, I highly recommend going to Supply Chain 247 and reading the 3 other features. It's really interesting stuff. I only covered the 2 I thought to be the most important here, but the other 3, like I said, were really interesting as well. Go check them out. Probably the less tangible result or crisis of the pandemic is the global economy. I'm going to be focusing on the US, since firstly it's one of the main drivers of the global economy, and secondly it contains FAANG, which is a few of the largest companies in the world. So looking at the Dow Jones Industrial Average, it fell over 10,000 points at the outset of the first lockdowns in March of 2020. However, it is worth noting that the Dow recovered these losses by mid-November of the same year and has been on a semi-upward slant ever since. Delta and Omicron both made dents, probably Omicron more so, as evidenced by the 500 to 1,000 point falls in a single day. These plummeting values were also reflected in the S&P 500 as well as the Nasdaq, albeit on different scales. On a large scale, COVID will seem a minor blip in the grand scheme of things. 10 years from now, the monetary effects will be gone, and markets will be fully back in the swing of things. Listen, the future is all the way up in the air. There is bound to be at least one more major variant, and Omicron doesn't look like it's fading. My personal belief is that most wealthy MDCs will be in an endemic-esque stage by 2024, with an additional booster shot for their population. However, LDCs will most likely be stuck with a severe brand of COVID well into 2026 or even 2028. Note that an endemic means that the virus no longer poses any threat to the majority of the population, but infections are still possible and deaths are still a semi-common occurrence among the elderly. An endemic for COVID is comparable to a bad flu season, meaning a few thousand deaths and tens of thousands of hospitalizations, but minimal infection overall. Obviously, this more applies to the unvaccinated instead of the unvaccinated. This may seem pessimistic, but again, it's just my opinion, so take my predictions with a grain of salt. Anyway, stay safe, get your booster shot, and I hope to see you some sunny day.